There's something unsettling about hotels. Even the nice ones feel temporary, like you're not supposed to stay long enough to leave some kind of imprint. I have stayed in dozens over the years, working in sales, traveling from city to city, pitching the same numbers to just different faces, always on the road, always somewhere in between where I wanted to be and where I need to go. I guess you get used to it after a while. The endless miles of the highway, takeout dinners, and the same dull hotel rooms. But every once in a while, something happens that makes you think twice about life on the road. On this particular trip, I was heading to a conference in some small town out west. Construction along the interstate had thrown me behind schedule, leaving me stuck in traffic for hours and hours. By the time I finally pulled into the hotel parking lot, it was well past 9. All I could think about was getting a hot meal and crashing in my room. I grabbed a quick bite at the nearby diner, filled up my tank for the next day's drive, and headed back to the hotel. The lobby was empty, except for a bored-looking clerk behind the desk. I checked in, grabbed my key, and made my way up to the second floor, room 112. The room was fine. It's always the same though. Beige, boring walls, a floral bedspread, a TV bolted to the wall, and a window overlooking the parking lot. Didn't matter if it was Omaha or Albuquerque, it always looked the same. I kicked off my shoes, turned on the TV for some background noise, and just settled into the stiff armchair by the window. I was tired, but not quite ready for bed yet. The sound of some late night TV show droned in the background as I flipped through my emails on my phone. Then that's when I heard a noise. At first it was muffled voices, the kind that you'd expect to hear from a couple of guests settling in next door. Thought nothing about it. People come and go, they talk, they move around. It's a hotel. Just part of the hotel experience. But after a few minutes, those same voices grew louder, more heated. A serious back and forth argument. I paused the TV and listened closer. Thud, thud. The sound of something hitting the wall. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 10:30 p.m. That argument next door was not dying down. In fact, it was getting worse. Those thuds turned into bangs, the kind you feel through the walls. Couldn't really make out words, but the intensity. Maybe it was just a couple having a bad night. Maybe somebody had too much to drink. But then, as suddenly as it started, those noises just stopped. Silence. For the next half hour, I sat there waiting for something else to happen, but the room next door was now eerily quiet. No voices, no bangs, no thuds. Just a faint hum of the AC, muted laughter from the TV. Eventually, I just shrugged it off, figured I'd heard the end of it. That was until a knock came. It was faint at first, just a soft rapping at the door. Not mine, the one next door. I muted the TV and listened. Hello? It's the hotel clerk. Is everything all right in there? A man's voice called out, muffled by the walls. I got up from my chair and moved to the window, just close enough to hear but not be seen. I heard the room next to me's door creak open, and there was a hushed conversation. Couldn't quite make out what they were saying, but I could tell the clerk was not really getting the answers they wanted. After a few minutes, the door closed and the clerk walked away. Should have been the end of it, I thought. But it wasn't. The banging started again, louder this time, like somebody was throwing the furniture around. Then it stopped. Another knock followed. This time 2 voices. 2 clerks, maybe. The conversation was longer, more tense. They left and, again, everything went quiet. I waited, half expecting another round of noise, but this time it stayed silent. I checked on the clock again. It was now almost midnight. I was exhausted, and whatever was going on next door really wasn't my business. I turned off the TV, shut off my lights, and climbed into bed. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of scratching. It was faint, like nails against wood, coming from the other side of the wall. My eyes snapped open, and for a second, I thought maybe I imagined it. That's when I heard it again. Slow and deliberate. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The hell is going on in here? I reached for my phone, ready to call down to the front desk, but the scratching stopped. Silent again. Maybe, hopefully, they'd finally settled down. But that's when I heard whispering. It started low like hushed conversations, but it quickly grew louder and more frantic. Voices overlapping, rushing words that I couldn't quite understand. It wasn't English, it wasn't anything I could make out. Just a stream of incomprehensible urgent noise. I threw the covers off and grabbed my phone. And that's when I heard footsteps, heavy, pounding footsteps, running from one side of the room to the other, and then a full force slam against the wall. My wall. I jumped out of bed, my heart in my throat. This was no normal argument. Somebody was in trouble. My thumb was hovering over the phone's call button, and that's when a scream rang out, a blood-curdling scream for help. I didn't think, I just moved. I grabbed my key and bolted for the door, yanking it open. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the flickering fluorescent lights. But the door next to mine, room 114, was cracked open, just slightly, enough for me to see in the darkness inside. Before I could react, the door swung open. A man burst out, slamming me in full force. He was wild-eyed, face pale and sweaty, his hair sticking up in every direction. He grabbed at me, his fingers digging into my arm. "Please, you gotta help me. You gotta help me," he gasped, his voice trembling. "They're trying to kill me. They poisoned me, I swear. Please, you gotta help me." I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. He tried to push his way into my room, his hands shaking as he clawed at the doorframe. "They're coming for me. You gotta let me in. I can't." Before I could even process what was happening, 2 hotel staff members appeared behind him, grabbing him by the arms. He thrashed, kicked, and screamed as they pulled him back into the hallway. "I'm not crazy. They poisoned me. They're trying to kill me." His voice echoed through the empty hallway as they dragged him away. I stood there, frozen, watching as they wrestled him down the corridor, his shouts growing fainter and fainter until they just disappeared altogether. I went back inside and closed my doors. My hands were trembling. I stood there for a long time, just staring at my door, heart still pounding. The hallway was now silent again. It felt like the world had just stopped. It was over now. At least, I thought so. The man's screams faded into nothing, but the weight of his words clung in the air like some kind of thick, humid fog. "They're trying to kill me," his voice echoing in my head over and over again. I shook my head, trying to snap out of it. This isn't my problem. Whatever had happened next door, the hotel staff had now taken care of it. I had no idea if he really was poisoned or if he was just some kind of nut job on a bender. But either way, I wasn't about to lose any more sleep over it. I locked my door, turned off the light, and crawled back into bed. My body was tired. My mind was wide awake though, replaying out the last few minutes over and over. The way he burst out of that room, that sheer panic in his eyes, it wasn't something that I could just easily forget. Finally, I'd say sometime after 2 a.m., sleep overtook me. I drifted off and my dreams were haunted by fragments of those night's events. When morning came, it almost didn't feel real. I woke up to sunlight streaming through that thin curtain, and the room filled up with that sterile hotel smell, cleaning products and old carpet. For a brief moment, I thought I'd dreamed that whole thing, that maybe the stress of the trip had finally gotten to me. But then I noticed my door was still bolted, and my phone was lying on the nightstand, the front desk number still on the screen. It wasn't a dream. I got up and pulled on my clothes, and decided to head downstairs. I wasn't eager to stick around for obvious reasons, but I needed to check out, grab some coffee, and figure out the drive for the rest of the day. My business meetings were literally the last thing on my mind, but I still had a job to do. The lobby was busier than I expected it to be. A couple of guests were milling about, talking to one another in hushed voices. Something was off. People glanced at me as I made my way to the front desk. their expressions unreadable. The clerk behind the desk looked tired, bags underneath his eyes, his uniform slightly rumpled. I cleared my throat. I need to check out of room 112. He nodded, typing something into the computer. Everything all right with your stay, sir? I hesitated. Well, there was a bit of an incident last night in the room next to mine. His hands paused on the keyboard. Talking about room 114? Yeah, some guy started banging on my door, saying the staff had poisoned him, that somebody was trying to kill him, screaming for help. Could still hear the echo of his voice. You guys took him away? What happened after that? The clerk quickly exchanged a glance with another employee that was standing nearby. We've had some trouble with that guest, he said slowly. He called the front desk several times last night, claiming there was multiple problems with his room. At first it was just small things. The bed was uncomfortable, the faucet was leaky, but then it escalated. He started saying the food was poisoned, that the air in his room wasn't safe to breathe. Yeah, he definitely seemed completely out of it, I added, like he wasn't in his right mind. The clerk sighed. Yeah, he's not well. We think he was on something, some kind of drug maybe. He's known for pulling stunts like this at different hotels. He checks in, causes a scene, then tries to demand a free room or some kind of other compensation. It's a scam that he runs. He lowered his voice. We had to phone the police last night. What happened to him? I asked, suddenly more curious than I should have been. They took him to the hospital. He'll likely spend the night in jail once he's cleared. The clerk then glanced over my shoulder, his eyes darting nervously to something behind me. We're really sorry for that disturbance, sir. We can comp you a breakfast if you'd like. I turned to see what he was looking at. A group of hotel staff were standing near the elevator, all speaking in low voices. One of them was one of the staff members who had wrestled with that man. He caught my eye. He gave me a tight-lipped smile, like he knew something that I didn't. No need, I muttered, still uneasy. I just want to get out of here. I grabbed my receipt and shoved it in my pocket and headed for the door. As I walked past the staff by the elevator, I overheard fragments of their conversation. He kept saying walls were moving, couldn't calm him down. Yeah, he was really losing it. Thought we were trying to poison him. I quickened my pace and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The parking lot was empty, save for a couple of cars, and the sun was just beginning to burn through the morning fog. I breathed it all in, the cool air quickly clearing my mind. But a part of me was still rattled. I told myself it was over, finally, and the guy was a scam artist, a junkie who'd gone too far. But as I drove down the highway, my mind kept going back to the night before. The way he slammed into the wall, the way he screamed out for help, the way his eyes had looked into mine when he said they were trying to kill him. I should have been relieved that it was over, that he was gone. But something just didn't sit right with me. The way the staff handled it, the strange looks, the nervous glances, it was almost like they were used to it. And then that scratching, the whispering, the pounding footsteps. Whatever happened in room 114, it was more than just a drugged up scam artist looking for a free room. There's something off, wrong about the place that I could not explain. And I definitely wasn't going to stick around for another night and find out what it was. I used to work the night shift at a mid-sized hotel, one of those chain places in the suburbs where everything's a little too clean and a little too quiet. You probably know the type, off a main road, just far enough from the city to attract people who didn't want to pay downtown prices. The kind of place where nothing really happens, until it does. And guess who gets a front row seat? Whichever poor employee was on shift that night. I guess if I'm being completely honest, it really wasn't a bad gig, but wasn't the best either. Most nights it was dead quiet. Just me, a cup of coffee, and a flickering monitor watching a couple of empty hallways. The occasional guest would stumble in late, or I'd deal with a lost tourist, but for the most part it was uneventful. The hardest part was staying awake, especially after midnight when time seemed to stretch out forever. There's paperwork and all kinds of clerical upkeep in the back, and of course, folding things. There was almost always something to help the time go by. I've been working there for almost 2 years at this point, and I'd seen my fair share of weirdos. There was always this guy who parked by the dumpster and just lingered long enough to make you wonder if he lived in his car, or came by day because we had a nice dark parking lot that he could get high in. Sometimes the occasional crackhead who'd somehow scrape together just enough cash to rent a room for the night, then refuse to leave the next morning. Domestic disputes were another common occurrence. Raised voices, slamming doors, the uncomfortable task of calling the police, and try not to think about what was really going on behind those closed doors. But most of that was manageable. It's part of the job. You deal with it, you make a note, and you move on. Don't let it stick and let it slide off your back, as my old man would say. Then came the night that I met the man who asked specifically for room 401A. It was a Wednesday night, middle of the week. Things were slower than ever. I was on the overnight shift, starting at 11 p.m. and running through to 7 a.m. The lobby was quiet. Only sounds were the faint hum of the AC, the soft clink of the coffee pot refilling itself for the third time that night. I'd say around midnight, the front door slid open, and a man walked right in. At first glance, there was nothing really remarkable about him. He had that typical business travel wear, mid-30s, clean-shaven, wearing a dark jacket and an over-the-button shirt. A little tired, but nothing out of the ordinary. He approached the desk, his steps pretty light and his expression calm. Didn't do anything to land on my radar. "Good evening, sir," I said, my voice breaking the silence. "You need a room for the night?" He nodded, his eyes scanning the lobby as if he was looking for something or somebody else. "Yeah," he said, his voice even. "I need a room, but not just any room. I want one in particular." I raised an eyebrow. Most people just wanted a room, any room. I've never had somebody request a specific one before. Okay, sure, which one?" "Room 401A, he said casually. I froze for a second, processing what he just asked me. The thing is, we didn't have any rooms labeled with letters. None of them. Our rooms were numbered by floor and unit count. First floor, rooms 100 to 113. Second floor, 214 to 227, and so on. Room 401A, that didn't exist. I thought maybe I misheard him, asked him to repeat it, and he said the same thing. 401A. When he said it this time, he was staring right through me, giving me this sly grin. I chuckled awkwardly, thinking he was making some kind of joke. Think you might have the wrong hotel. We don't have a room 401A. Maybe you mean room 440? The man's expression didn't change. If anything, he seemed amused now, like I was the one making a mistake. No, I'm sure it's room 401A. I blinked, trying to figure out how to explain it. "Sir, there is no room 401A. We don't have rooms with letters here. You can get a room on the 4th floor if that's what you're looking for, but..." His demeanor shifted instantly. His calm, mild energy evaporated, replaced by something darker and much more aggressive. He stepped closer to the desk now, his eyes narrowing. "I asked for room 401A. Are you telling me you don't have it?" I took an involuntary step back, my heart racing. This wasn't just a guy who got the wrong place. He was serious, dead serious, and his frustration seemed to be growing by the second. Suddenly, it then occurred to me he could have a knife or a gun. "Look, sir," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know what to tell you. We don't have a room 401A. It's literally not in our system. Look, maybe you got the wrong hotel, or maybe there's been some other kind of mistake. I can get you a different room easily. How about room 440? It's available and it's on the 4th floor." His eyes locked onto mine, cold and calculating. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me like he was committing every detail in my face into his memory. Then he slowly leaned in, lowered his voice to a menacing whisper. "Lying," he hissed. "I know that room is ready, and you're gonna regret keeping it from me." Before I could respond, he stepped back and straightened his jacket, walked out of the lobby without enough sun. The automatic doors slid shut behind him, leaving me standing there shaken and confused. I spent the rest of my shift on edge, jumping at every noise I heard. I kept expecting him to come back and start yelling or worse, but he never did. That night passed without incident, and by the time my shift ended, I almost convinced myself it was just some weird misunderstanding. Maybe that guy was just crazy, or maybe he was playing some kind of prank that I didn't understand. But that wouldn't be much of a story, would it? Because it didn't end there. Exactly 1 week passed, and the memory of that strange encounter slowly began to fade. Sure, I kept my eyes peeled during my shifts, half expecting that same man to show up again. But nothing out of the ordinary happened again. The hotel had its usual flow of late-night guests, some weirder than others, but nobody came looking for a room that didn't exist. By the time that next Wednesday had rolled around, I almost had written that whole thing off. People like him do show up sometimes. I've had my share of crazy customers over the years, paranoid guests who thought the government was watching them, couples who got into fights and tried to drag me inside their drama. This guy was really no different, just another nutcase who probably confused us with another hotel. That night, I clocked in for my shift at the usual time, 11 p.m. sharp. My coworker Jason was finishing up his shift. It looked like he had a long day. He gave me a tired nod as I walked in, grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair. "Quiet night?" I asked, hoping for a smooth, uneventful shift. "Mostly," Jason said, stretching his arms with a yawn. "But some weird guy came by earlier, dropped off a key card." I frowned. Key card? "Yeah, he said it wasn't for this hotel, but figured we'd want it back. Thing is, it's one of ours, just an old one. It looked like it'd been through hell." Now I was interested. We changed our key cards a few years ago, but a few older ones were probably still floating around. It wasn't unusual for people to hold on to them after checkout, but most of the time, they were useless after being deactivated. I walked over to the counter and Jason handed me the key card. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the number that was printed on it. Room 401A. My mouth fell open. I must have stared at that card for a whole 60 seconds, mind racing to make sense of it. "Are you sure this is ours?" Jason shrugged. "It does look like one of the old ones. You'd know better than me. You've been here longer." The plastic was worn and scratched like it had been through years and years of use, but there it was, clear as day. Room 401A. It made no sense. That room did not exist. I knew that, and so did Jason, but here's this key card, staring back at me like some kind of sick joke. I'll look into it," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just some kind of mix-up." Jason didn't seem too concerned. He gave me a half-hearted wave and headed for the door, probably eager to get home and forget about the weirdness of his shift. As soon as he left, I slid back into my chair behind the desk, that key card still in my hand. My fingers brushed over the numbers again, as if touching it would somehow change what was printed on there. It didn't. There was suddenly a deep desire inside me to try that key card on every door in the building, just to see which unit used to be the infamous 401A. I glanced up at the clock, 11:30 p.m. The night stretched out before me, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure I wanted to be here. I spent the next hour nervously flipping through the channels on the TV behind my desk, trying to distract myself, but I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every single creak of the building, every faint noise from the hallway, it set me on edge. I kept glancing back and forth at the security monitors, half expecting to see that man, the one who'd asked for room 401A, staring back at me from one of those empty hallways. But the halls were deserted. No guests, no staff, just a flickering image of the empty fourth floor on one of the screens. But that's when I heard it. At first, it was just this light tapping, faint and irregular, like somebody was knocking on a door from far away. I ignored it, thinking it was probably the ice machine acting up, or maybe a guest closing their door too hard. But that sound did not stop. It grew louder and more incessant, like it was moving closer to me. I sat up listening. The tapping was coming from behind a wall. My wall. The office was in the back of the hotel, nowhere near the guest room, so there's no reason anybody should be knocking on the other side. I stood up quickly, heart pounding, walked to the far end of the office where the sound was the loudest. It was slow and methodical, almost like somebody was tapping out a message. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to figure out what it could be, and the noise stopped. I froze, waiting. Breath caught in my throat as a second stretched out before me, the silence becoming unbearable. The phone rang. I jumped and nearly knocked the chair over as I rushed to grab the receiver. Front desk, I said, voice a little shaky. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence on the other end, and then breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing. Like somebody was standing just inches away from the phone, listening. Hello? I said again. Anybody there? That same breathing continued for a few more seconds before the line went dead. I slammed the phone down, my heart racing, and checked the caller ID on the phone's display. No number, just a string of zeros, the kind you see when somebody's calling from inside the hotel. I stared at the phone, waiting for it to ring again, but the room was silent. Too silent. That tapping had stopped, the eerie breathing now gone. I glanced at the security monitors. Still nothing. The fourth floor was empty, halls still eerily quiet. I tried to convince myself, okay, it's just a prank. There's a guest messing with me. Or maybe the guy from last week was playing some long game to freak me out. But there was something in the pit of my stomach that told me this was different. This wasn't just some drunk guest or a faulty phone line. I spent the next few hours in a state of heightened alert, checking the security footage every few seconds, pacing the office, listening for any other strange sounds. Every now and again, I thought I'd hear faint noises, footsteps in the distance, the sound of a door closing, but nobody or anything ever appeared on the monitors. Then around 3 a.m., the phone rang again. I picked it up cautiously, half expecting the same breathing that I heard from before. But this time, there was a voice, barely even above a whisper, but I could hear it clearly. Room 401A, the voice said. It's waiting for you. Then the line went dead. I stood there, receiver still in hand, mind now racing. The voice on the phone had been so calm, so matter-of-fact. But it wasn't just the words that chilled me, it was the tone. It sounded like somebody who knew something that I didn't, like they were in on a secret that I was about to uncover whether I wanted to or not. That was enough for me. I holed myself up in the main office and just waited for dawn. No one came in, and I didn't make any effort to get anything else done. When the sun came up, I left a note with my notice on it, and left the second my relief got there. No job out there is worth that kind of headache. And I never saw that asshole again. Never got any more weird calls. But for one night, I would have told you that I believe in ghosts. When I told this story to some friends a few months later, they had a theory that pretty much fit the bill. They thought maybe 401A could be code for something. Perhaps that guy wasn't trying to buy a room, but something else altogether. Either way, I don't want to know what that was. I've worked as a hotel maid for longer than I really care to admit. You see all kinds of things at this job. People at their worst mostly. Stains you can't imagine. Arguments behind closed doors that echo throughout the walls. And guests who leave rooms in such a state you wonder what kind of lives they lead. After a while though, it does all become routine. You stop really thinking too hard about it. But there was one morning that I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. That day is completely burned into my memory. It was early, maybe around 5:30 a.m. The sun wasn't even up yet, and I was already down in the linen room, alone with the hum of the washers and dryers. It was one of those shifts where time feels like it's crawling. It was quiet. Too quiet if I'm being honest. There was just something comforting about the noise of a hotel coming to life. All the guests checking out. The distant rumble of luggage wheels on carpets, voices drifting through the corridors. But that morning, it was just me and the machines, and it seemed like nothing else. I was folding some sheets, stacking them into neat piles for the carts when I heard it. A sound, faint at first, like somebody dragging something heavy down the hallway. I paused, listened. Strange. Too early for anybody to be leaving. But it didn't sound like a suitcase, more like shuffling, uneven, as if whoever or whatever had no sense of rhythm. I thought maybe one of the night shift clerks had left something in the hall again, but the same sound stopped almost as soon as it began. I shook it off and just went back to folding. It was very easy to let my mind play tricks on me during these quiet hours. After all, a lot of strange things happen in hotels. I've learned not to question most of them. By the time the first guest checked out, I was halfway through my loading cart with towels and toiletries. I had a pretty good system down. Get everything ready in the early hours before people would begin filtering out, then hit the rooms one by one as they emptied. Preferred it that way, being ahead of the rush. It gave me a sense of control in a job that offered very little of it. But that morning was definitely different. The sound that I'd heard earlier just kept nagging at me, like a little itch in the back of my mind, something that I couldn't shake. Something was off and I definitely felt it. After a little while, I heard something again, only it wasn't a shuffle this time, it was a thump. A very heavy thud, like somebody had dropped something heavy or someone in the hallway. I set down that stack of sheets in my hands and stood still, listening. The same sound came again, followed by another thump, thump. Uneven, unsettling. I glanced at the clock. It was now 6:30 a.m. Still early, but by now some guests should be stirring, checking out or moving about. I peeked outside the linen room door and saw nothing, just a long dimly lit hallway stretching out before me, quiet as a grave. Except for one thing. A pile of luggage a few doors down. The bags were haphazardly thrown together. Clothes were spilling out of them like somebody had been in a hurry, but I didn't see anybody. There was no one in sight. I frowned. That wasn't normal. Guests leaving their bags in the hall? Sure, I guess sometimes, but never in that kind of mess. Where was the person who these belonged to? As I stood there, a low sound caught my ear. A voice, faint and muffled, coming from the open door near the pile of luggage. Room 212. I hesitated. I'd definitely seen my fair share of odd behavior from guests. Drunks, fights, people too out of it to even realize where they were. But this time, I don't know, I just felt something in me that made me pause. that voice, it didn't sound right. I couldn't really make out any words. There was a strange quality to it, like whoever was speaking was struggling to form coherent sentences. Against my better judgment, I crept down the hall toward the open door. My footsteps were barely audible on that thick carpet. The closer I got, the more unnerving the sound became. The voice was clearer now, but it was fragmented, broken, like somebody talking in their sleep. Or worse, somebody not entirely in control of themselves. I stopped just outside the door. My heart was pounding in my chest. The luggage lay before me at these odd angles, half packed, as though somebody tried to leave in a hurry but was interrupted. The door was ajar, just enough for me to peer inside. I knocked lightly. "Housekeeping, is everything okay?" For a moment, I was met with silence. The kind of silence that hangs heavy in the air, thick and oppressive. Then, the voice came again, low and garbled, like a response filtered through static. I still could not make out what was being said, and the sound itself made my skin crawl. Something was very wrong. I pushed the door open. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the room beyond. It literally looked like a bomb had gone off. Clothes were strewn across the floor. An overturned suitcase lay on the bed, its contents spilled out in a heap. The curtains were drawn, casting the room in dim, sickly light. It was chaos, far more than just a rushed departure. It looked like something terrible had definitely taken place here. But that's not what stopped me dead in my tracks. No, it was the figure lying on the floor. A woman, middle-aged, wearing a rumpled bathrobe, was lying between the two beds. Her body was twisting and writhing in these strange, unnatural movements. She was rolling back and forth, her limbs jerking erratically, her hands clawing at the carpet. Her face was contorted in agony, her mouth wide open in this silent scream. I froze with my mind struggling to process what I was seeing in front of me. Was it a seizure, a stroke? I'd seen medical emergencies before, but nothing like this. The way she moved, it just wasn't right. It was like her body was not her own, like something else was controlling her. For a moment, I just stood there paralyzed. My instincts screamed at me to do something, to call for help. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from that horrific scene in front of me. Then I heard a sound, a shuffling, frantic movement coming from the bedroom. I turned my head and there he was. The man, her husband I assumed, was cramped in the bathroom, hunched over the sink, frantically stuffing items into a small toiletry bag. His clothes were wrinkled and disheveled, his hair sticking up at these odd angles, as if he hadn't slept in days. His hands trembled as he shoved toothbrushes, razors, and bottles into the bag, his movements jerky and desperate. "Sir," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, what's happening? Is she—" He didn't respond, didn't even look at me. He just kept hacking, eyes fixed on the task in front of him, as if it was really the only thing that mattered. Like he couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge what was happening in the room behind him. I took a step forward, my heart hammering in my chest. "Sir, your wife needs help. Is she having a seizure?" He whirled around so fast, I barely had any time to react. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, wild. His face was pale, slick with sweat, and his mouth hung wide open, like he was trying to catch his breath. For a moment, we just stared at one another, his gaze flickering between me and the woman on the floor. His expression was a mixture of panic and something else, something sinister, something darker. "Get out," he spat, his voice low and guttural. "This has nothing to do with you." I took a step back, my hands now trembling. "She needs help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You cannot just leave her like this. I'll call an ambulance." "No!" he shouted, voice cracking. He took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. No one's calling anyone. She's fine. She's fine, okay? I glanced down at the woman. She was not fine. Her body was still writhing, her hands clawing at the carpet, but now there was blood. Small scratches where her nails had torn into the skin of her arms. I looked at him with my heart still pounding. You need to get her to a hospital. But before I could finish that sentence, he lunged at me, his body slamming into mine, knocking the breath out of my lungs. I stumbled backward, crashing into the doorframe, his hands immediately reaching for my throat, his fingers curling around my neck with this surprising strength. I gasped, trying to break free, but he was too strong. You're not calling anyone, he growled, his face now inches from mine. This is none of your business. Panic surged through me. I twisted and kicked, managing to wrench myself free from his grasp just long enough to push him away. He stumbled backwards, but not far enough. His eyes blazed with fury, and I knew I only had seconds before he came at me again. I didn't wait. I bolted out of that room, my feet barely even touching the ground as I ran down that hallway. My heart was thundering in my chest and my breath coming in these ragged gasps. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps against the carpet growing louder and closer. I reached the lobby, practically throwing myself behind the front desk. The night clerk, Kelsey was her name, looked up in alarm as I collapsed into the counter, gasping for breath. Kelsey, call the police, I panted, clutching the edge of the desk for support. There's a man, he's dangerous, his wife. Just call the police now. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers flew across the phone, dialing the emergency number as I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. I heard her voice sharp and urgent as she explained the situation to the dispatcher on the phone. But her words quickly blurred together in my mind. All I could think about was the look in that man's eyes and the way his hands felt around my throat, and that poor woman lying on the floor, helpless. I waited for him to come down that hall and expected to see him burst into the lobby, screaming, furious, ready to finish what he started, but he never came. The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours. I heard Kelsey hang up the phone, her face pale and drawn. Hey, the police are on their way, she said, her voice trembling. We just waited there together, huddled up behind the desk, listening to the silence. Every creak, every distant sound made my heart jump. I kept glancing toward the hallway, expecting him to appear at any moment, but the lobby remained still and eerily quiet. When the police arrived, it was a flurry of motion. Uniformed officers, questions, flashing lights. I barely registered any of it. I told them what happened, my voice shaking the whole time, my mind reeling. As they listened to me, they nodded, then made their way down the hall, toward room 212, their weapons drawn. Kelsey and I just stood there waiting and watching. Officers disappeared around the corner. For a few agonizing minutes, there was nothing, just silence. I held my breath, mind racing with 1,000 different possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Then I heard the sound of somebody shouting, one of the officers' voice, sharp and commanding, followed by the sound of scuffling. It was all over in seconds. The shouting then grew louder, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps rushing down the hallway. I could feel my heart in my throat. Every muscle in my body tensed as I waited to hear what was going on. The officers came into view, 2 of them holding the man from 212. His arms were twisted behind his back, wrists bound by handcuffs, but he was fighting, body jerking, feet dragging as they hauled him towards the lobby. His face was contorted with rage, those wild eyes scanning the room. For a second, I thought he might look straight at me, but his gaze swept right past without landing on me. Instead, he was just muttering to himself, these low, unintelligible words spilling from his lips like a fevered chant. His hair was matted with sweat, clothes rumpled and torn. His hands were smeared with something. Blood. The officers dragged him out of the lobby towards the flashing lights of the patrol cars. He never stopped muttering, his head lolled to one side, his body limp as they shoved him in the back seat of one of the cars. A sigh of relief came, and my entire body sagged against the desk. It was over, but the tension in my chest did not ease. Is he? Is she? I couldn't get the words out. My mouth wouldn't work. One of the officers, an older guy, approached us. "She's alive," he said, his voice almost cheery. "Barely, though. She had a seizure, looks like. We'll let the paramedics take a look at her." I nodded, not sure if I was relieved or just plain horrified. "What about him?" The officer's eyes darkened. "He's out of his mind. He seems to have snapped completely, lost it all. We found him pacing back and forth in the room talking to himself. He didn't even notice us at first, just kept packing his things, like he was trying to leave." My stomach turned. I could picture it. The woman convulsing on the floor while her husband frantically packed, trying to leave her behind, trying to pretend she wasn't even there. "He said something," I whispered, more to myself than really to the officer. "He said this was none of my business and I just couldn't leave her there." The officer nodded. "You did the right thing, and you might have saved her life." I looked back down that hallway, the door to room 212 still ajar, dark and silent. It looked like any other door, but now I knew better. Something awful had taken place in that room. Something that had twisted a man's mind and left the woman writhing on the floor half dead. I don't know what would have happened had I not gone in. I remember Herman Mudgett, but back then he wasn't known as H.H. Holmes, the name that they'd plastered in the papers years later when everything came to light. No, to us, he was just Herman, a scrawny, fidgety boy from a humble family in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. H.H. Holmes was a monster, the beast of Chicago, the tortured doctor himself. Herman, on the other hand, wasn't anything of the sort. He was timid, boring, and not well liked. If he wasn't running from his father, he was defending himself from relentless onslaught of his classmates. There was very little rest in the way of Herman's life. There was always something about him, though, something unsettling that nobody could quite put their finger on. I saw it in his eyes. He had this nervous way about him, always shifting, always looking like he was waiting for something, and when he wasn't moving, it was worse. That was when his true nature peeked out from behind those pale, lifeless eyes. Even as a boy, Herman just had the look of somebody who wanted to do something bad, something he knew he shouldn't. Sometimes he would sit so still that you swear he stopped breathing, slowly slipping into some kind of coma. What could a person sit there and think about to make them a literal statue? It always gave us the creeps. The Mudgett family had its roots in the area. Good, strong English stock. Farmers mostly, hard-working folk. Herman's father, Levi, was a stern Methodist. I remember him as a towering man, a heavy drinker who held his beliefs like a hammer, always ready to strike. Levi was a hard man to live under. His temper ruled that house, and it ruled Herman in particular. Sometimes I'd see the boy after school, sitting on the edge of the town square, his face swollen, bruises on his arms or worse, a trickle of blood running from a cut on his cheek or lip. None of us ever really asked him about it. It wasn't our place. You understand. Back then, a man's house was his own business, and his family was just part of that business. But we knew better. Everybody in town knew. Levi was a cruel man. It was always Herman who bore the brunt of his wrath. Some folks might tell you now that Herman was a born killer, that he had murder in his heart from the beginning. But I'll tell you this, I think his family made him that way. His father beat him into it. Herman never talked about the abuse, not directly at least, but you could see the weight of it put on him. You'd hear his father screaming sometimes, even from the street, and God knows what he was screaming about. Didn't really need much of an excuse to lash out at Herman. I recall passing the Mudgett farm one day, hearing Levi's voice booming from inside the barn. He was yelling at Herman to pick up the pace, while the boy worked in the muck, dragging some heavy tool across the dirt. Then would come the sound of a whip, a real one, a crack that made my spine go rigid. I never heard Herman cry out though, not once. I think he stopped crying long before he reached his teens. But if his father's temper didn't get to him, the boys at school certainly tried. Herman was smart, everybody knew that. Teachers would praise him. He could even recite lessons with ease, even as a child. That made him a direct target though. The other boys hated him for it, especially because he just wasn't really tough. They'd corner him after class in the alley behind the schoolhouse, taunting him, pushing him around. Teacher's pet, they'd call him, and worse. I'll never forget the day that it went beyond name-calling. There was a skeleton inside our classroom. It wasn't unusual in those days. It was used for anatomy lessons, I suppose. The bones were yellowed and old, and it sat in the corner like something forgotten. The teacher never thought much of it, but the boys, well, they thought it was the perfect way to get at Herman. They told him if he was so smart, he should prove it by hugging that skeleton. For some reason, they thought it was funny just watching him squirm. The first time they did it, Herman was terrified. He cried, begged them not to make him touch it, but they held him there, forced his hands around those brittle bones, laughing at his fear. I remember seeing his face as he hugged it, tears streaking down his cheeks, his whole body shaking. It was like watching someone break piece by piece. After a few more times, something changed inside of him. Herman no longer cried. He didn't beg. Instead, he touched the skeleton willingly. His fingers lingered on the bones, tracing them slowly, and his face, I swear to God, was almost like he was enjoying it, like he was no longer afraid of death. No, maybe that wasn't it. Almost like death had become his friend. I don't know if you've ever seen somebody come alive in the presence of something horrible, but that's what I feel like I saw come alive in Herman that day. Something inside of him had woken up, something dark. I don't think the others really noticed it, or if they did, they just didn't care. They just continued to laugh like always. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside Herman. The bullying never stopped, and neither did the beatings at home. It just got worse. I'd see him some mornings, standing on the edge of the schoolyard, eyes vacant, staring at nothing. That emptiness stayed with him, even when he tried to smile. But sometimes when he didn't think anybody was watching, I would catch him looking at the boys with something in his eyes that I didn't like. It wasn't fear, nor anger, or even sadness. It felt like hunger. A lot of people like to say that monsters are born, that killers come into this world already broken, already twisted. I don't believe that though. I believe Herman was made by his father's fists, by the jeer and taunts of those boys at school, and by the twisted sense of control that he found in that skeleton, that bag of bones that just became his escape. By the time we all finished school, I don't think there was really much left of Herman that we all used to know. He still walked and talked like a boy, but there was now something else behind those eyes, something darker and colder, like a switch had been flipped inside of him. There was no turning it off. I left Gilmanton soon after I graduated and went my own way. But I know Herman stayed, for a while anyway. I didn't really hear much about him for years and years. Not until the paper started running stories about H.H. Holmes, about the murder castle, the disappearances, the bodies. And when I looked at that picture of the man they called Holmes, I couldn't help but remember that nervous, fidgety boy from New Hampshire. I still see him sometimes, in my dreams. He's standing there in that schoolhouse, next to the skeleton. Only now it's not a skeleton. It's one of his victims, just hanging there, lifeless. And Herman, well, Herman's smiling, just like he did back then, like he's very proud of what he's become. I first met Herman in the anatomy lab. It was in the fall of my second year at University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery. Back then, I was eager, maybe too eager, to make my mark. Professor William James Herdman ran the anatomy program. He was something of a legend in those parts. I was lucky to be under his tutelage. That's where Herman Mudgett and I crossed paths. He was definitely a strange one, even back then. His hands were always stained, always slick with some kind of undefiable grime. It seemed permanently caked with blood and flesh, and I don't think I ever saw him wash them once. You would expect that in medical school, surrounded by corpses and the dead, you'd have certain levels of cleanliness, and that would be the standard. But Herman, no, he reveled in it, like the blood was some kind of trophy. Even outside of class, I'd catch him inspecting his nails, picking out whatever bits of tissue had found their way underneath them. We weren't really friends, not really. We just worked together underneath the professor and spent long hours dissecting, cutting, and cataloging. It was a job, and Herman took to it with this unnatural enthusiasm. He was not like the rest of us. The other students, myself included, treated the cadavers with this kind of reverence. These were people once, after all. But to Herman, they were little more than material, objects to be carved and rearranged like a puzzle. I tried to avoid him after hours, but sometimes it was just impossible. We'd find ourselves alone in the lab, the smell of formaldehyde hanging thick in the air, the cadavers covered with these stained white sheets, like ghosts waiting to wake. Herman would linger after class, hovering over the bodies, his fingers tracing the incisions with this kind of glee. "Fascinating, isn't it?" he'd say, and I'd nod, though I couldn't shake the chill that crawled up my spine whenever he was around me. It was during one of those after-hour sessions that things began to spiral. Professor Herdman gathered us all in the lab one evening, just a handful of students, and explained the problem. We had far too many students and not enough cadavers. The demand had grown beyond what the anatomy department could supply us. Without more bodies to dissect, the program was at risk. The professor was desperate. You could see it hung in the way he wrung his hands, pacing the floor. "We need a solution," he'd say, "or we'll fall behind." Suggestions came in quickly. Some students suggested we'd use animal carcasses, pigs or goats, but that wouldn't suffice for medical studies. Another thought was crafting some kind of fake cadaver, an idea that was met with immediate desertion. And then that's when Herman spoke up. "We could always dig a few up," he said, as casually as if he were talking about picking flowers from a garden. The room then went silent, and I'll never forget the way Professor looked at Herman then, his eyes wide for a second before he quickly composed himself. The rest of us exchanged nervous glances, dismissing it as a joke. Grave robbing? Surely not. But Professor Herdman didn't laugh. He didn't shake his head or move on to the next suggestion. Instead, he waved the other students away, keeping Herman and myself behind. When the room cleared, it was just us three, standing there in the cold light of the gas lamps and the smell of death all around us. "You weren't serious, were you?" I asked, hoping, praying Herman had just been joking. But he just smiled, that thin-lipped grin that never quite reached his eyes. "Why not?" Herman said. "The bodies are already there. Nobody's gonna miss a few." The professor did not say a word at first, but I could see the gears turning in his head. It was madness, of course, but desperation has a way of making men do mad things. And the truth was, the department needed more bodies. Without them, the students couldn't learn. And without learning, the university would suffer. It started with just one, a test if you will. Professor Herdman scouted the cemetery, one just far enough out of town that nobody would think to look for missing bodies, but close enough to make the trip manageable. He sent Herman and I to dig it up late one night. The cold air, enough our breath came out in visible puffs. I did not want to be there. I did not want to have any part in it. But Herman had this way of pulling people into his schemes. And besides, I was scared, not of being caught, but of Herman himself. He took to the task with this unnerving ease. While I suggested the shovel, the weight of the deed pressing down on me, Herman worked like he was born for it, slicing right through the dirt like it was nothing. When we finally unearthed the coffin, he knelt beside it, hands trembling. Not with fear, but with excitement. I watched in stunned silence as he pried the lid open and stared down at the corpse inside, his face bathed in pale moonlight. "She's perfect," he whispered, as though speaking to a lover. For the first time, I realized that Herman didn't just see the bodies as tools. He definitely saw them as something more, something intimate. That first body was the hardest, but it didn't take long for the others to follow. What started as a one-time solution quickly turned into a full-blown conspiracy. Professor Herdman kept quiet about it, of course, but he didn't stop us. In fact, he encouraged it. He needed the cadavers to keep the program going, and we provided them. But it was Herman who truly thrived in the darkness. He began planning the trips and selecting which graves that we would rob, always choosing certain type of bodies, young, female, recently deceased. He'd never say why, and I never really asked. I was far too deep in it by then, too afraid of what would happen if I tried to back out now. Besides, the cadavers that we brought in kept us at the top of our class. The professor turned a blind eye to the source, happy to have a steady supply for all of his lectures. There were nights when Herman and I would be out in the cemetery, digging up another grave. I'd catch him smiling to himself, humming underneath his breath as he worked. At the time, I didn't understand it, but in retrospect, it all makes sense. Herman was never happier than when he was handling a body. The colder, the fresher, the better. There was something about the stillness of death that just calmed him, soothed him in ways that nothing else ever could. I started to distance myself after a while, making excuses not to join them on those late night trips, pretending I had other obligations. Herman never really seemed to mind. He didn't need me. By the time we graduated, he had become the best anatomist in our class. His skill with the scalpel unmatched by anybody. But it wasn't talent, it was pure obsession. And I knew deep down, his hunger for bodies would not stop with medical school. Years later, when I read about H.H. Holmes in the papers, I wasn't surprised. The disappearances, the murders, the bodies found in his so-called murder castle, it all made sense to me. Herman had been perfecting his craft for years now. We had all been blind to it, or maybe we just didn't want to see what was right there in front of us. Looking back, I realized that the corpses that we stole were just the beginning. They were practice. Herman was prepping for something bigger, something far more terrifying. And while the world may remember him as H.H. Holmes, I will always know him as Herman Mudgett, medical student, and the man who loved death just a little too much. I used to know a man named Dr. Henry H. Holmes, though back then we simply just called him Henry. I had my shop in the same district of Chicago, where he first set up his little empire. To most of us, he was an unremarkable but ambitious fellow. I'd say we even respected him, at least in the beginning. The man worked tirelessly at the drugstore down on Wallace Avenue. He'd spend hours on end behind the counter, mixing up medicines and tending to customers with that polite smile of his. It wasn't long before he bought the building and the business, and you could see him practically glow with pride when he talked about all his plans. At first it was just the store, but then Henry did something that caught everybody's attention. He bought the lot across the street. I remember the day that the construction started. You could hear the hammers and saws from a mile away, echoing down the streets like the city itself was being built from the ground up. That was when things started to change. The murmurs began. People started talking about how Henry wasn't paying his construction teams, about how he'd taken out loans for furniture and fixtures, but hadn't paid a cent toward any of them. They said he was up to his neck in debt and wouldn't be long before he drowned himself in it. Still, though, he seemed calm, confident even. He'd stroll around the construction site in his fine suit, tipping his hat to the workers, always with that same smile on his face. It was like he knew something that we all didn't. Maybe he really did. The building went up fast, a 2-story behemoth that stood out from the rest of the block. The bottom floor was for commercial businesses, shops, offices, and the upper floor held apartments. Modest by the look of them. People rented them out for a while, and it seemed like Henry's business was in fact booming. There was always air about that place, a feeling that just wasn't quite right. It was the whispers that got to me, the things that some folks said about him, claiming they'd seen him meeting with shady characters late at night, while others insisted he was just hiding something in that building of his. I'd say the most popular rumor was that he never paid off his debts. He was on the verge of collapse, and yet Henry kept building. Then came the day that the papers exploded with the story, and I'll never forget the headlines. Dr. Holmes arrested for murder and fraud. We couldn't believe it. Henry, a killer? It didn't make sense at first, but the more I read, the more it sank in. He'd been involved in a scheme so thick with murder, kidnapping, and fraud that it was hard to wrap your head completely around it. The story started in Philadelphia, where Henry had apparently killed a man under the guise of suicide to collect a life insurance policy. The payout had gone to the man's widow, and then this was the part that chilled me. Henry had kidnapped her children and then fled to Canada. The news hit the neighborhood like a freight train. We had all known Henry, or at least we thought we did. He was a respectable businessman, wasn't he? But now, people began looking at him and the business with a different eye. We started asking questions. What else had he been hiding? And then there was that castle. That damn castle. You see, not long before the papers broke the story, Henry had added a 3rd floor to his building. He'd been talking it up for months, saying it was the anticipation of the World's Columbian Exposition. It was perfect timing, he said. People would come from all over the world, and they'd need a place to stay. He planned to rent out rooms at a premium price. It sounded like a brilliant business move, until the rumors started again. This time the stories were wild. People claimed the entire building was a murder castle, designed specifically to kill its occupants in the most horrifying ways imaginable. They said the hallways were a maze of dead ends. There were false windows, gas chambers, hidden rooms, even trap doors. Every conversation in the district buzzed with speculation. Folks who had never set foot inside the castle spoke with this absolute certainty about the horrors hidden within. I still remember the night that I stood outside that towering structure, staring up at its dark windows, listening to the wind whistle through the alleyways. It looked so innocent from the outside, just another building in a bustling city. But now with all these rumors swirling, it seemed more like a tomb, a place where people went in, but never came out. There were some whispers that Henry had built these secret passageways so he could sneak into rooms unnoticed, that he'd outfit certain chambers with elaborate gas systems to suffocate his victims all while they slept. The worst part, nobody could say for sure if it was true or not. It was all conjecture, rumor, but the fear in people's voices, the way they spoke about him, like he was some kind of demon, it gnawed at me. For weeks, the district buzzed with talk of his castle, of the grotesque possibilities it held within. I heard stories about women who'd gone missing, about guests who had checked in but never checked out. People began avoiding the area, walking wide circles around the place like it was cursed or something. But as shocking as the rumors were, nothing compared to the truth that came out later. When they finally arrested Henry, the authorities began to dig into his past, into his life itself, and what they found was almost stranger than fiction. They said he made a series of confessions all while in custody, but most of them were lies. Stories woven from the same imagination that had built his empire of deceit. Some of the people he claimed to have killed were still alive, while others couldn't be accounted for at all. And the castle? Well, it wasn't what everybody thought. Oh, there were hidden rooms, secret passageways, and strange architectural choices. But not because Henry was some kind of mastermind murderer. No, the truth was stranger. He built those rooms to commit fraud, to steal from his guests, and hide deliveries from creditors. The castle wasn't really a house of horrors. It was a house of theft. Still, there were bodies. They found the remains of one woman and one child in the castle, enough to prove that Henry wasn't just a crook, that he had blood on his hands. But it wasn't hundreds and hundreds of victims like the newspapers had all sensationalized. There weren't piles of bones hidden in the walls or mass graves in the basement. No, Henry's reign of terror had been much quieter, much more insidious than that. Even so, the horror of it lingered. The community could not shake off the image of Henry as a killer, a man who had tricked us all into believing he was just another businessman. And maybe that's just what scared us all the most, that somebody could hide such a darkness behind a polite smile and a handshake. Years later, when I think back to those days, it's not the castle or the bodies that haunt me. It's the memory of Henry himself. The way he carried himself with such ease, such confidence, even as the walls were closing in around him. That smile, that thin-lipped smile, as if he knew the truth all along, that monsters don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes, they walk among us in broad daylight, and they might even wish you a good morning.